The restaurant was the kind of place where people lowered their voices without realizing it. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, casting a warm glow over polished marble floors. Soft piano music floated in the background, blending with the quiet clinking of glasses and cutlery. It was the kind of place where wealth didn't need to announce itself, it simply existed. And then she walked in. Her name was Alina. She paused for just a second at the entrance, not out of hesitation, but to take it all in. She wore a simple navy blue dress, elegant but not flashy. Her heels clicked softly against the floor as she stepped forward, her posture straight, her expression calm. There was nothing loud about her presence, but it carried weight, the kind that didn't need validation. Still, a few heads turned. Not all of them were kind. The host at the front desk looked up, his polite smile flickering for just a moment too long before settling back into place. "Good evening," he said, scanning her quickly. "Do you have a reservation?" Alina nodded. "Yes, under the name Carter." He checked the list, his finger running down the page. There it was. His eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. "Ah, yes, right this way." As she followed him deeper into the restaurant, she could feel that subtle shift in the room. Conversations didn't stop, but they softened. Glances lingered just a second longer than necessary. Some curious, some dismissive. She was used to it, but being used to something doesn't make it right. Her table was near the center, a perfect view of the entire dining room, the kind of seat people usually requested weeks in advance. She thanked the host and sat down, placing her small purse beside her. A waiter approached almost immediately. "Good evening, ma'am. Can I start you off with something to drink? Just water for now, thank you." Of course. As he walked away, Alina let out a quiet breath. She glanced around, taking in the room again, not with insecurity, but with awareness. Every detail mattered to her. Every movement, every expression, because moments like this, they had a way of revealing people. She had barely picked up the menu when the energy in the room shifted again. This time, it was louder. A man entered mid-50s, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored suit that practically screamed money. His watch alone could probably pay someone's rent for a year. He walked in like he owned not just the restaurant, but the air inside it. People noticed him immediately. Some nodded in recognition, others straightened in their seats. His name was Richard Halston, and he was used to being seen. "Richard!" The manager rushed over, smiling wide. "We weren't expecting you tonight." Richard chuckled, a deep, confident sound. "Decided to stop by. Hope that's not a problem." Duppa-duppa-duppa-duppa-duppa-duppa-duppa-duppa-duppa-duppa-duppa. As they walked through the dining area, Richard's gaze swept across the room, not searching, just observing, measuring. And then it landed on her. It was subtle at first. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a pause in his stride. Alina didn't notice immediately. She was focused on her menu, scanning the options, completely unaware that she had just become the center of someone else's attention. Richard slowed down. "Who's that?" he asked casually, tilting his head slightly in her direction. The manager glanced over. "I'm not sure, sir." "She has a reservation." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. There was something in that sound. Something dismissive. Something irritated. He didn't move on. Instead, he changed direction. "Actually," he said, adjusting his cufflinks, "I'll sit there tonight." The manager blinked. "There, sir? That table is, I know where it is." His tone wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The kind of authority he carried didn't rely on volume. The manager hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Of course, they approached. Alina looked up as she sensed someone stopping beside her table. Her eyes met Richard's for the first time. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth but edged. "I believe there's been a mistake." Alina blinked, confused. "I'm sorry." "This table," he gestured lightly, "is usually reserved for certain guests." The words hung in the air. Carefully chosen, deliberately vague. Alina's grip on the menu tightened just slightly. "I do have a reservation," she replied calmly. Richard nodded slowly, as if humoring a child. "Yes, I heard. But sometimes errors happen." He glanced at the manager. "Don't they?" The manager shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, the reservation is valid." Richard raised a hand, silencing him without even looking. Then his attention returned to Alina. "I'm sure they can find you another seat." he said, his tone polite but condescending. Somewhere more appropriate. There it was, not loud, not explicit, but unmistakable. A few nearby diners had started to notice. Conversations quieted just enough to catch fragments of what was happening. Alina felt the weight of it, all the eyes, the tension, the unspoken assumptions. For a second, just 1 second, something flickered across her face. Not fear, not even anger, something deeper. Then it was gone. She set the menu down slowly and looked up at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said. "Ants." Her voice was calm, steady, unshaken, and that seemed to irritate him more than anything else. Richard let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "You see," he said, glancing briefly around as if inviting silent agreement, "this is what's wrong these days. People don't understand boundaries." The word lingered, sharp, loaded. The manager looked like he wanted to disappear. "Sir, please." But Richard wasn't done. He stepped a little closer to the table, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel personal. "I've been coming here for years," he said. "I know how things work, and I can assure you, this isn't how they're supposed to." Alina didn't look away. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shrink. Instead, she leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression unreadable. "And yet," she said quietly, "here I am." A pause. A long one. The kind that stretches just enough to make people uncomfortable. Richard's smile faded. For the first time, there was a crack in his composure. A subtle shift in his posture. His confidence didn't disappear, but it wavered, just slightly. And he didn't like that, not one bit. Around them, the room had gone almost completely silent now. People weren't pretending anymore. They were watching, waiting, sensing that something bigger than a simple disagreement was unfolding. Richard straightened his jacket. "Ants. Let me make this simple," he said, his tone colder now. "You can either move voluntarily, or we can make this unpleasant." The words landed heavy, but Alina didn't flinch. Instead, she did something no one expected. She smiled. Not a mocking smile, not a nervous one. A calm, knowing smile. And that's when the entire situation began to shift in a way no one in that room was prepared for. For a moment, no one spoke. It was the kind of silence that didn't just sit in the air, it pressed down on it. You could almost hear people holding their breath, waiting to see who would break first. Alina's smile didn't fade. If anything, it unsettled Richard more than resistance would have. "You think this is amusing?" he asked, his voice tightening just slightly. "No," she replied gently. "I think it's familiar." That word landed differently. Not sharp, not defensive, just honest. Richard frowned. "Familiar?" She nodded. "This moment, this tone, the assumption that I don't belong somewhere I've clearly been invited to." She tilted her head just a little. "It happens more often than you'd think." A few people nearby shifted in their seats. Because now it wasn't just a private exchange anymore. It was something bigger, something uncomfortably real. Richard let out a quiet scoff. "You're making this into something it's not, don't I?" Alina asked, her voice still calm. "Then what is it?" "Ants." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around, as if expecting someone, anyone, to step in and support him. But no one did. Not the manager, not the staff, not the guests who had suddenly become very interested in their plates. That annoyed him. "You're sitting at a table that has a certain standard," he said finally, choosing his words carefully again. "And I don't meet it?" she asked. Richard hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but Alina caught it. Everyone did. He cleared his throat. "I'm saying this place has a reputation. People come here expecting a certain environment." Alina leaned forward slightly now, resting her hands calmly on the table. "And what exactly about me disrupts that environment?" she asked. This time the question didn't just hang in the air, it echoed, because now he had nowhere to hide behind vague words. The manager shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, maybe we should I've got this," Richard snapped, just a bit too quickly. His composure was slipping, piece by piece. He turned back to Alina, forcing a thin smile. "You're twisting my words. No," she said softly. "I'm asking you to stand by them." Another pause, longer this time. Across the room, a woman whispered something to her partner. Someone else subtly pulled out their phone, though they tried to keep it low. Ants. The atmosphere had changed completely now. This wasn't just an uncomfortable moment. It was becoming a scene, and Richard knew it. He He straightened his shoulders, trying to regain control. "Look," he said, lowering his voice again, but there was an edge now. "I don't have time for this. Manager, yes, sir? Move her." The words were simple, direct, and heavy. The manager froze. "Sir?" I said move her," Richard repeated, louder this time. A few gasps rippled through the room. Alina didn't react immediately. She simply looked at the manager, not with anger, but with quiet understanding. It put him in an impossible position. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he began hesitantly, "but perhaps we could offer you another table, maybe something more private." "No," Alina said. Not loudly, but firmly. The manager stopped mid-sentence. "I chose this table," she continued. "I reserved it, and I intend to stay here." Her tone wasn't aggressive. It didn't need to be. It was certain. Richard let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Unbelievable." He turned slightly, gesturing around the room as if appealing to an invisible jury. "Is everyone just going to pretend this is normal?" he asked. No one answered, not a single person. And that silence said more than any words could. For the first time, something like doubt flickered across his face. Just for a second. Then it hardened into frustration. "Fine," he muttered. "If the management won't handle it, I will." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The movement was sharp, deliberate. Alina watched him, her expression unchanged. "Who are you calling?" she asked. He didn't look at her. "Someone who understands how things are supposed to work." He stepped a few feet away, turning his back slightly as he dialed. The room buzzed quietly now, whispers, shifting chairs, the faint clink of someone setting down a glass just a little too hard. Alina sat still, composed, but inside there was a storm, not of fear, of memory. Moments like this weren't new to her. Different places, different faces, same underlying message. "You don't belong." She had heard it in 100 different ways, but she had also learned something else over time. You don't always have to fight loudly to be heard. Sometimes you just have to refuse to move. Richard ended the call quickly and turned back, a small, confident smirk returning to his face. "It'll be handled," he said. Alina raised an eyebrow slightly. "Handled?" "Yes," he replied. "Properly." The way he said it made a few people visibly uncomfortable. Minutes passed. They felt longer than they were. No one resumed their normal conversations. The piano music continued, but it felt distant now, almost out of place. Then, finally, the front doors opened. Two men in dark suits stepped inside. Not security, not staff. Something about them was different, sharper, more official. They scanned the room briefly before their eyes landed on Richard. He gave them a small nod. "Over here." They approached with steady, purposeful steps. The manager looked confused. "Sir, who are it's fine," Richard cut in, clearly pleased with himself now. "Like I said, handled." The two men stopped beside him. "Mr. Halston," one of them said, his tone neutral. Richard smiled. "Took you long enough." Then he gestured toward Alina without even looking at her. "I'd like this situation resolved." The two men turned their attention to Alina. For a split second, the room seemed to hold its breath again, because whatever happened next was going to change everything. One of the men studied her face carefully. And then something unexpected happened. His expression shifted. Not to suspicion, not to authority, but to recognition. "Ma'am," he said slowly. Alina met his gaze. And for the first time since this began, her calm expression softened, just slightly. "Good to see you again," she said. Richard's smile faltered. "Wait. What?" The man straightened immediately, his entire demeanor changing. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, but now, the question wasn't directed at Alina. It was directed at Richard, and just like that, the balance of power in the room began to flip. Richard blinked, just once, but it was enough. The confidence he had been holding on to so tightly slipped, just a little. "I'm sorry, what?" he said, looking between the two men and Alina. "You know her?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a small step forward, positioning himself slightly closer to Alina, not in a protective way, but in a respectful one. The kind of distance people keep when they recognize someone important. "Yes," he said calmly. "We do." There was no hesitation in his voice now, no uncertainty, and that changed everything. Richard let out a short laugh, but it didn't carry the same weight as before. "All right, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding here." The second man spoke this time, his tone even firmer. "That's what we're trying to determine." The manager looked completely lost now, his eyes darting between all of them. I don't understand what's happening." Alina finally shifted in her seat, sitting up a little straighter. She folded her hands calmly on the table, her gaze steady. "What's happening?" she said quietly. "Is that I came here for dinner. Simple, clear. But it carried more weight now than it had minutes ago." Richard exhaled sharply. "No, what's happening is that you're turning a simple request into a spectacle." "A simple request?" Alina repeated. "Ants." Her voice wasn't louder, but it was sharper. "For me to leave a table I reserved, because you decided I don't belong here?" A murmur rippled through the room. Now people weren't just watching, they were reacting. Richard felt it, and it made him defensive. "I never said that," he snapped. "You didn't have to," she replied. That landed harder than anything else so far. One of the suited men glanced at Richard, his expression now clearly unimpressed. "Sir," he said, "we're going to need you to explain exactly why you called us." Richard straightened, trying to regain control again. "Because this establishment has standards, and when those standards aren't upheld, it reflects poorly on people like me who support it." The words came out polished, carefully crafted, but now, instead of sounding powerful, they sounded hollow. The second man tilted his head slightly. And how exactly were those standards not upheld? Richard hesitated again. That pause was becoming a pattern. He gestured vaguely toward Alina. "I think it's obvious. No," the man replied calmly. "It's not." Silence. Thick, heavy, unforgiving. For the first time since this began, Richard looked unsure. He glanced around again, but the room had changed. No one was silently agreeing with him anymore. No one was nodding along. If anything, they were waiting for him to say something he clearly couldn't. "Ants." Alina watched him carefully. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no triumph, just quiet observation. "Go on," she said softly. "Say it." Her words weren't loud, but they cut through everything. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again, because now, saying what he meant would expose him completely, and not saying it made him look exactly like what he was trying not to be, cornered. The first suited man turned slightly toward Alina again. "Ma'am, would you like to clarify what happened from your perspective?" She paused for a moment, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she chose her words carefully. "He approached my table," she began, her voice steady, "and told me there had been a mistake, that this table was reserved for certain guests. Then he suggested I move somewhere more appropriate." She let the words sit there, unedited, unsoftened. The room absorbed them. The second man's jaw tightened slightly. "And did the restaurant staff support that request?" he asked. The manager immediately shook his head. No, absolutely not. Her reservation is completely valid." Alina nodded. "He then asked them to move me anyway." Another murmur spread. Richard stepped forward, his patience clearly gone now. "This is ridiculous. You're all blowing this out of proportion, are we?" the first man asked. His tone had shifted again. Less neutral now. Ants, more pointed. Richard ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping in. "Look, I made a call because I expected professionalism. Instead, I'm being interrogated like I've done something wrong." The second man looked at him directly. "That depends," he said. "Have you?" The question hung there. Simple, but impossible to dodge. Richard didn't answer, because now he didn't have control of the room anymore. Not the people, not the narrative, and definitely not the outcome. Alina slowly reached for her glass of water, taking a small sip. Her hands were steady, her breathing calm, but her eyes held something deeper now. Not just patience, not just strength. Something that suggested this moment was only the beginning of something much bigger. She set the glass down gently, then looked at the two men. "I didn't ask for this to escalate," she said, "but I also won't pretend it didn't happen." The first man nodded respectfully. "Understood." Then he turned back to Richard. "Sir, we're going to need you to step aside with us." Richard frowned. "Excuse me?" "This conversation isn't over," the man said. The tone left no room for argument, and for the first time, Richard realized something that hadn't fully hit him yet. He wasn't in control anymore, not even close. Ants. But what he didn't realize, what no one in that room fully realized yet, was just how far this situation was about to go. Richard didn't move at first. It wasn't defiance, not entirely. It was disbelief. The kind that settles in when someone realizes, a little too late, that the ground beneath them isn't as solid as they thought. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice lower now, but still trying to hold on to authority. "Not until this is cleared up. It will be," the first man replied calmly. "That's exactly why we're asking you to step aside." There was no aggression in his tone, just certainty, and that made it harder to fight. Around them, the room had completely shifted. People weren't pretending to eat anymore. Some leaned forward slightly, others whispered behind their hands. The quiet elegance of the restaurant had been replaced by something raw, something real. Richard looked around once more, but the support he expected never came. Not from the manager, not from the guests, not from anyone. And that's when it hit him. He was alone in this. He exhaled sharply, adjusting his jacket like it might somehow restore his control. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's talk." The two men nodded and guided him a few steps away, just far enough to create distance, but not enough to escape the eyes of the room. Alina remained seated, still, composed, tense. But now something had changed in her expression. There was no tension left, no uncertainty, just quiet resolve. The manager approached her hesitantly. "Ma'am, I am truly sorry for all of this." She looked up at him, her expression softening slightly. "You don't need to apologize for something you didn't do." He swallowed. "Still, this shouldn't have happened." "No," she agreed quietly. "It shouldn't have." A few tables away, a woman gave Alina a small, supportive nod. Someone else murmured, "That was wrong," under their breath. The shift in the room was undeniable now, not just attention, but understanding. Respect. Meanwhile, Richard's conversation wasn't going the way he expected. "You need to understand who you're dealing with," he was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "I've supported this place for years. I know people who, sir," the second man interrupted, calm but firm. "This isn't about who you know." "It absolutely is," Richard snapped. "That's how the world works." The first man shook his head slightly. "Not tonight." That single sentence landed heavier than anything else. Richard's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake, no," the man replied. "We're correct in one. Silence again. Short, but final." Richard's shoulders dropped, just a fraction. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough to reveal something had shifted inside him. "Ants. Then explain it to me," he said, quieter now. "Explain why you're treating me like I'm the problem." The two men exchanged a brief glance. Then the first one spoke. "Because the call you made," he began, choosing his words carefully, "was escalated beyond this restaurant." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," the second man added, "that when you reported a situation, it triggered a review." "A review of what?" Richard asked, confusion creeping into his voice now. "Of conduct," the man replied. Richard blinked. "Conduct?" The first man nodded slightly. "Yours." That word landed like a weight, heavy, unavoidable. Richard let out a short laugh, but it was empty. "This is insane, is it?" the second man asked. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but stopped, because now, for the first time, he was replaying everything in his head, the words, the tone, the assumptions. And suddenly, they didn't sound the same as they had before. Across the room, Alina watched quietly, not with satisfaction, not with victory, but with something deeper, understanding. Because she had seen this moment before, not the exact situation, not this man but this shift. The moment when someone is forced to confront something they've never had to question. Richard ran a hand over his face. "Ants. This is being blown out of proportion," he said again, but even he didn't sound convinced anymore. "No," the first man replied. "It's being addressed." Another pause. Then, after a moment, he added, "And there's something else you should know." Richard looked up, his expression tense. "What?" The man glanced briefly toward Alina, then back at him. "The woman you approached," he said, "is the reason we're here so quickly." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," the second man said, his voice steady, "she's not just a guest." That was the moment, the exact moment everything clicked. Richard's eyes slowly shifted toward Alina. Really looked at her this time. Not as an interruption, not as an inconvenience, but as a person. And for the first time he realized he had no idea who she actually was. "Then who is she?" he asked quietly. The first man didn't hesitate. "She's part of the oversight board that reviews high-profile complaints across this entire hospitality group." The words didn't just land. They echoed. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The calm, the composure, the refusal to move. This wasn't just strength. It was certainty. Richard's face drained of color. "You're saying," he began, his voice barely holding together, "I called in a complaint, and it came back to her?" "Yes," the man said simply. Silence. Complete. Total. Ants. Even the faint background music seemed to disappear. Because now, the power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had reversed. Completely. Richard stood there, motionless. For the first time that night, he didn't have a response, didn't have a comeback, didn't have control. He looked at Alina again. And this time, there was no arrogance left in his expression, just realization, and something else. Regret. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he walked back toward her table. Every step felt heavier than the last. The room watched in absolute silence. Alina met his gaze as he approached. She didn't stand. She didn't change her posture. She simply waited. Richard stopped a few feet away. For a moment, he said nothing. Then finally, "I didn't know," he said. His voice was quieter now, stripped of its earlier confidence. Alina tilted her head slightly. "And if you had?" she asked. The question was simple, but it cut deeper than anything else that had been said. Richard hesitated, because now, the answer mattered. Not to the room, not to the staff, but to himself. He started, then stopped. Because the truth wasn't easy to say. Alina held his gaze, calm, unshaken. "You shouldn't have needed to know who I was," she said softly. "To treat me with respect." That was it. Not loud, not dramatic, but final. The kind of truth that doesn't need emphasis to be powerful. Richard lowered his eyes. Ants. Just for a moment. But it was enough, because everyone in that room saw it. The shift, the realization, the weight of what had just happened. Alina stood up slowly, not in triumph, not in anger, but with quiet dignity. She picked up her purse, then looked at the manager. "I won't be staying," she said gently. The manager looked stunned. "Ma'am, please, we would be honored if you..." She shook her head slightly. "No, not tonight." Then she turned back to Richard. "I hope," she said, her voice steady, "this moment stays with you longer than this evening. No anger, no bitterness, just truth." She gave a small nod and walked away. Her heels echoed softly across the marble floor as she headed toward the exit. No one stopped her. No one spoke. They just watched. Because they all knew something bigger than a simple argument had just taken place. Something that couldn't be undone. Something that would be remembered. Richard stood there still. The room around him slowly began to breathe again, quiet conversations returning, subtle glances exchanged. But for him, nothing felt the same. Because for the first time in a long time, he had been forced to see something he had spent years ignoring. And he knew there was no going back from that.